So I'm going to be the first discussant. I just have a few comments I want to make, and then I'll pass it over and introduce Malcolm. I really liked the presentation and the paper, the two papers, the shorter paper and the longer paper, more on anonymous, that I read. And at the end of Gabriella's remarks, she also brought up the Tiananmen Square 1989 movement, which actually, even before I got to that part of the paper, I had started thinking about a theory that was developed by sociologist Joshua Guang, who's now at Stanford, writing about what he called unorganized collective action. He was talking specifically about China, but he made a lot of connections to state socialist regimes generally. He was writing this in the early 90s. And he argued that this is a really overlooked but extremely important type of collective action in socialist countries. And he uses examples from the 1950s in China with strikes, the Cultural Revolution, the 1976 Tiananmen movement, which was a reaction against the Cultural Revolution, and then, of course, 1989. And he argues that it's really the institutions of state socialism that can produce this kind of unorganized collective action that is almost always targeting the state. And so the state is sort of the recipient of this mass political movement, even though the state, of course, under state socialism, spends a lot of time and energy repressing organized institutions within organized groups in society. So this type of unorganized, weakly organized collective action is even more prevalent now because of the development of all these new information technologies, and not just, of course, in state socialist regimes like China, but also in democracies. And it's interesting, I guess, to me, and this is maybe a question to raise, is you would think, though, I mean, his argument about state socialist institutions producing this, we don't have those institutions in most of these cases, but the targets are similar targets. So if it's not necessarily the state, but it's large corporations or it's the mainstream media, Church of Scientology, when they do something that seems to establish or sort of state their power, using Tom Cruise in that video. So they target the powerful and often powerfully linked actors. And of course, one of the demonstrations, one of the goals of Occupy Wall Street is to show that all of these institutions are in fact linked. And the state is much less independent than we would like to think it is from corporations. There also seems to me, though, something about the lulls, which I really like as an idea, that's reactionary. It's kind of a reactionary response. It's a response against mainstream trends or behavior as a way to critique it. I think you could say it's deeply ironic or it's very cynical. And so one of the things I want to think about is, what kind of political movements will these be when we get to something beyond social revolution or protests, lawmaking, elections, or what might we think is happening right now in the Middle East, which is post-revolutionary state building, which diminishes the lulls because it's quite boring, it's very contentious, and it's really about distributional issues that we can be cynical about, but it's quite dangerous, I think, to be cynical about. I guess relatedly, and this is another sort of thing to think about, is how do these movements play out differently in democracies and authoritarian regimes? It's much easier to harness these in periods of political flux, to use it to push revolutions forward. We saw that in the Arab Spring. But I can also imagine in places like China, where the state is still quite strong, they could be appropriated by the state more easily. And you already see in China clearly on the internet both anti-state behavior and ultra-nationalist behavior. And I think of two examples in particular. During the Tibetan demonstrations in 2008, there were demonstrations on U.S. campuses, and there was an attempt by a Chinese student at Duke, to try to bring the two warring groups of students, the pro-Tibet and pro-China students, together. She was then, I guess, trolled, maybe is the word for it, on the internet in China, and her family lived in a small village in northern China, and her family was targeted, physically targeted, not just targeted on the internet. So that's sort of, you could see the internet being harnessed, also not in an organized way by the state, but again, through political socialization and through propaganda, to be encouraged to be pro-state, to take the state side, and particularly things that involve foreign policy. The other example, which is much more about anti-state behavior, is when the high-speed rail crash happened in Wenzhou earlier this year. The local government immediately started to bury the trains. I mean, almost immediately. Probably there were people still alive in the trains while they were being buried. And unfortunately, right around, people had cell phones, and this went viral on the internet, and the state had to, pull back and really change how it was dealing with the issue. So clearly, the internet is having that strong sort of anti-state role as well. But I do think that when we think about where the state is still quite strong, can still effectively control the internet, at least to some extent, whether or not this kind of unorganized action can be harnessed by these powerful political actors. I also wonder, too, about the reasoning for this, and it may be partly not just because the state is strong, but also because you don't see, maybe this is not, I don't know if this is true, but maybe I could hypothesize that perhaps the lulls are not as important in places where it's sort of pre-political, or in places where politics are really live or die, very important in terms of what happens, and in the sense sort of, still waiting for some kind of political shift. And in that kind of much more earnest atmosphere, whether or not these tendencies are maybe more easily harnessed. Because of course, the lulls is about it's about not accepting state power. It's about rejecting it. So I guess that I'll end with this question about, so is the lulls just a kind of deeply pessimistic reaction in developed democracies to a feeling of that all politics are bad and all politics should be avoided?